So in this presentation, we're going to talk about land and resource conflicts in kind of a very general way, but then through the example of the FARC in Colombia. So we'll get right into it. The first couple of slides here are just to help us think about the way in which land and resources are tied to the legacies of colonialism, as well as to politics, economics, and social relations across Latin America. So this is a quote from the textbook that I alluded to in a previous presentation that I assigned last year, but didn't assign for this class. But it helps us think about the kind of gross inequalities between different groups of people in Latin America. And these are economic inequalities that we're thinking about here. So as this author Duncan Green said, the concentration of land in very few hands, which grew as capitalist agriculture expanded, made Latin America the most unequal continent in the world. And so what he's talking about there is something that we've alluded to before. It's the alienation from the land and from resources of indigenous people and of poorer people in Latin America, all of that land being accrued and held by either the wealthy within their own nations or by outside groups like United Fruit Company, for example. So that's one we've already talked about, that we already know something about in terms of how that multinational corporation was able to take advantage of the wealth of the land and of the labor of local people in a way that profited the company, but did not profit the people. And so again, these are the kinds of trends, this is what we're talking about when we talk about capitalist agriculture, large-scale agriculture that's run by large corporations. Also, on even kind of smaller scales, this is an example from Guatemala of a coffee planter, and coffee planting has become, it's not quite the agribusiness that we're talking about when we think about United Fruit, but instead there are kind of mid-size plantations in places like Guatemala that plant and harvest coffee beans that then sell those on the international market. And these can sometimes be Ladino people who are able to acquire and build some land. Sometimes they are the descendants of German immigrants who came to Guatemala at the beginning of the 20th century. But again, all of these different plantations are owned by a person or a small group of people, and hundreds of poorer people, whether Mayan people or Ladino people who don't own land, have to work on these plantations. And the attitude of the owners toward the workers is what I want to get at here. So this one, Lauren, mentioned, I can't give them meat and vegetables on top of everything else or I'd go bankrupt. Anyway, those people are not used to it. They don't want it. This is actually an attitude that has been prevalent in northern New Mexico in recent years, unfortunately. When outsiders or people in larger cities look at the heroin epidemics that have plagued smaller towns like Española or Truchas, there's a text from my wife there. But people looking at the culture of Nuevo Mexicanos and saying that their kind of Hispanic culture, their communal culture, that background is what keeps them in conditions of poverty. And I also teach New Mexico history, and I see these parallels between rural New Mexico and Latin America all too often. I love a quote, though, that I once read from Father Casimiro Roca. He died just a couple of years ago. He was the priest at the Santuario de Chimayo. And he said something to the effect, I don't have it right in front of me, something to the effect that people are poor in northern New Mexico because they lack opportunity, they lack jobs, they lack a good education, and they turn to these kinds of things like heroin and other kinds of problems for those reasons. The issue is poverty. The issues are inequality, not culture. Culture is something that obviously plays a role in people's lives, but it also is an excuse all too often for kind of explaining away poverty, saying, well, they're happy that way. They're not used to living any differently. And so as we go through today, I want us to think about those ways in which politics, economics, and larger issues overlap with access to resources and poverty. We're going to think about the case of the FARC. This is one that was very prevalent about a year ago when the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, finally finished a years-long process of hammering out a peace deal with the group known as the FARC. And we'll get into more of the history of that in just a minute. But he finally was able to hammer out a peace deal after a long period of time. But there had been a political promise that there would be a referendum in Colombia. So again, this meant that the people of Colombia would get to vote on that peace deal. They ended up voting it down. Santos still won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts anyway, and was able to use other means going through the Congress of Colombia to get the peace deal enacted after the fact anyway. So some changes were made based on the no result of the referendum, and the peace deal did finally go into effect at the end of, I can't remember if it was December 2016 or January of 2017. But it's been in effect for a while. And so, again, we're going to talk about how that story helps us to understand these issues of poverty and conflict and the issue of land and resources right at the heart of that. We'll also talk about the water wars in Bolivia and Cochabamba in particular, and the new kind of environmental issue of lithium extraction, also in Bolivia, but in the salt flats of Argentina and Chile as well, right, where those three countries come together. These links here, this one goes to a blog post on a little town called Tomochic in rural northwestern Chihuahua, and the other one is to an article on the town of Canudos in Brazil. You can read those if you get the chance, and I would recommend that you do. They're interesting cases from the 1890s that kind of help us think about how modernization and capitalist development looked to people who were who didn't experience that before, how it changed their customs, their ways of using land, and their ways of relating to resources. So those are resources, or I guess I should say sources for you to go and look at to get more information. But I'll talk about that issue of what is called usos y costumbres, uses and customs, versus law and capital, which became the norm. And again, all of these things together, I hope, will help us to understand the issue of inequality and issues of unequal access to land and resources in Latin America.